The Psychology of 90s Baby by Simple Psych. Let's get into
You
it.
know what's strange?
You know what's strange about people born in the 1990s?
They remember a world.
They remember a world that
I'm a 90s baby. You know, it's kind of cool. You know what's funny though? Those videos where they like, what year you was born in? 2000 and something. And then they ask like the other guy like, what year you was born in? They like 19, and you see like fucking some old ass shit in the background, or like the dinosaur crying out, bro. It cracks me up. Like, I feel like old man.
doesn't exist
anymore.
They played outside
until the streetlights came
But
on.
also remember
their first AIM screen name. They used encyclopedias for school projects,
but also downloaded
music on
They're
Napster.
the
They're the
last
last generation who had a childhood without smartphones, but came of age with social media. And that split created a psychology researchers are calling 90s kids syndrome. If you were born between 1990 and 1999, you occupy a space in history that will never be repeated. You're not quite a millennial. You're definitely not Gen Z. You're the bridge between two incompatible worlds: Cartoon Network and YouTube, Blockbuster and Netflix, playing outside and playing online. And here's what nobody tells you.
That is true, because I slowly saw like things change, and I do have that nostalgia of like watching Tom and Jerry, or like Kid Next Door, trying to go out, play some marbles and shit like that. Like, I could agree with that.
Split
childhood created adults who are simultaneously nostalgic for simplicity and fluent in complexity. And it's affecting your mental health in ways you probably don't even recognize.
Picture this.
It's 1998. You're 8 years old. Saturday morning means waking up early for cartoons. Scooby-Doo, Rugrats, DuckTales. You pour yourself a bowl of sugary cereal and sit cross-legged on the floor in front of the
No
TV.
care in the world,
No
bro.
tablets, no streaming services, no on-demand anything. If you missed it, you missed it. And somehow,
Bro,
that made it matter.
If you ever go to bed and you was waiting for that one show or movie and you missed it, bro. Good times, bro. Just know you're going to school the next day and everybody talking about it, and you there looking like, Mama should have woke me up.
After cartoons,
you head outside. Not because your parents told you to, because that's what kids did. You played hide and seek until dusk. You climbed trees. You rode bikes through the neighborhood without helmets or supervision. Scraped knees and muddy clothes weren't emergencies. They were badges of honor, proving you'd actually lived that day. According to research on 90s childhood, kids spent an average of 3 to 4 hours outside daily. Today, less than 30 minutes. A 2023 WHO study found that over 80% of today's adolescents don't meet recommended physical activity levels. But you were the last generation that experienced unstructured outdoor play as the default, not the exception. You didn't need fancy toys. A stick became a sword. An empty lot became a battlefield. Your backyard transformed into whatever your imagination needed it to be.
Issue with the SpongeBob imagination.
And because you
couldn't Google what to do when bored, you developed something rare. Creativity born from emptiness. The ability to generate fun from nothing. But here's where it gets complicated. You didn't just grow up analog. You lived through the transition. You remember VHS tapes and rewinding them before returning to Blockbuster. But you also remember when DVDs felt like magic.
Never had a VH tape, but DVDs.
You used
dial-up internet where a single web page took 5 minutes to load. But by high school, you had broadband. You typed school papers on actual typewriters in elementary school. By middle school, you were using Word documents. According to researchers, 90s babies experienced a unique blend of traditional education and the beginning of tech-based learning. You spent hours in libraries using card catalogs and encyclopedias. But you were also the first generation to use computers in school regularly. You're bilingual in a way no generation before or after will ever be. Analog native, digital fluent. And social media? You remember life before it. You had actual privacy. When you did something embarrassing, only the people there knew about it. No phones filming, no viral videos, no permanent digital record of your worst moments. One 90s baby put it perfectly. We all talked crazy amounts of shit about each other and did shockingly inappropriate things, but we never had to worry about it ending up where everyone could see it. You got to figure out who you were in private. That's a luxury that will never exist again. But then MySpace launched when you were a teenager. Facebook opened to everyone when you were in high school or college. Instagram appeared as you entered adulthood. You learned to curate yourself, to perform your life for an audience, to seek validation through likes and comments.
And the algorithm.
And that shift, it split your psychology in half.
We need the algorithm. Stick it in me. Pump it in my face.
Here's what
researchers noticed. 90s babies experience unusually intense nostalgia. They call it 90s kids syndrome. And it's not just sentimentality, it's neurological. According to studies on psychological essentialism, people tend to believe their personal experiences are more authentic than others. And 90s babies, they lived through a fundamental shift. They witnessed the death of one world and the birth of another. So when they look back, they're not just remembering their childhood. They're mourning an entire way of life that disappeared. The rosy retrospection bias explains why you idealize the past. Your brain filters out the mundane and distressing parts and preserves the emotional highs. It's not that the 90s were perfect. You just remember them that way. Because what you're actually missing isn't the decade, it's the feeling. Being fully present without constant comparison. Living without performing. Existing without documenting. One researcher described 90s kids perfectly. They are the living testimony endorsing the fall of antiquity and the rise of modernity. You're the only generation that can compare both worlds accurately. You know what was gained. You also know what was lost. Here's the part that's harder to talk about. A study from the University of California, analyzing over 27,500 adults, found something devastating. People born in the 90s have worse mental health than any previous generation. Depression, anxiety, and other mental disorders are significantly higher among 90s babies compared to those born in the 80s.
But you could say the same for like every other generation, because I would think each generation change in a way, you know, just saying.
And these disorders get progressively
like we're special because I guess the technology got advanced, but we're not that special.
Worse with age. The researchers concluded that technology and social media use are primary factors. But it's more than that. You were raised with one set of values. Emotions and sentiments controlled us, as one researcher put it. Then, forced to adapt to a world where devices dominate everything. You learn that friendships were built through shared experiences. Then you watch social media turn connection into performance. You developed self-worth through actual accomplishments. Then you entered a world where value is measured in followers and likes. That cognitive dissonance creates psychological strain. You're not depressed because you're weak. You're exhausted because you're living in two incompatible realities simultaneously. But here's what 90s babies have that other generations don't. Perspective. You know what life was like without constant connectivity. So you can put your phone down at dinner, take tech-free vacations, sleep without checking devices, because you remember what presence actually feels like. You value authenticity over performance because you developed identity before audiences existed. You understand patience because you waited for things, for songs to download, for photos to develop, for your favorite show to air at its scheduled time. You learned delayed gratification wasn't just acceptable. It was normal. You have what researchers call a balanced childhood that straddled the line between analog and digital worlds. You climbed trees that straddled the line between analog and digital worlds. You climbed trees and coded websites. You played tag and played video games. You read books and browsed the early internet. That balance is rare and it's valuable. Today, 90s babies are in their mid-20s to mid-30s. You're contributing to society in significant ways. You bring traditional values and technological fluency. You translate between generations at work. You bridge your boomer parents and your Gen Alpha kids. You're the mediators, the explainers, the ones who remember both before and after. Here's what nobody tells you about being a 90s baby. You'll spend your life
animation is dope though, I can't lie.
caught between nostalgia and adaptation. You'll watch younger generations grow up completely digital and feel both envious and relieved they'll never know what they're missing. You'll hear older generations romanticize the good old days and think, I actually remember those days. They weren't that simple. You're not better than other generations. You're different, shaped by timing, by being born at the exact moment when the old world was ending and the new one was beginning. You carry both. You belong fully to neither. And maybe that's not weakness. Maybe that's wisdom. You see what younger generations lost. You understand what older generations can't grasp. You hold both truths without needing to pick a side. The world changed while you were growing up. And instead of breaking you, it made you adaptable, resilient, aware. You're not confused about who you are. You're just the only generation that remembers both worlds clearly enough to compare them honestly. If this felt personal, if you've been carrying this nostalgia and didn't know why, you're not alone. This channel explores the psychology of people caught between worlds. Subscribe to understand the patterns shaping who you are. And if you're a 90s baby, drop your birth year in the comments. Let's see how many of us are out here, quietly bridging two worlds nobody else remembers existed simultaneously. Because you're not nostalgic for the 90s. You're nostalgic for the feeling of being fully present. And maybe, just maybe, you can find that feeling again.
Let me see this one.
If you were born between 1986 and 1990, you grew up rewinding VHS tapes. And then, before you finished high school, you were burning CDs. And then, before you finished college, you were downloading music illegally off Napster. And then there was a streaming service for everything. And the whole conversation moved on like none of it had happened. You recorded songs off the radio onto a cassette tape, holding your breath during the DJ's intro, finger on the record button, hoping he wouldn't talk over the beginning.
I used to do that.
You knew the exact afternoon Napster made that ritual obsolete. You were there for both. You had a Discman that skipped if you breathed wrong. Then an iPod the size of a deck of cards that held 1,000 songs. Then a phone that was all of those things plus a camera plus the internet in roughly 9 years. In the middle of the most formative decade of your life, you grew up with Saturday morning cartoons, the kind you had to wake up for. There was no rewinding, no on demand. If you slept through it, it was gone. You knew the sound of a dial-up modem, not as a meme people play for laughs, but as the actual sound of your afternoon. You waited 4 minutes for a single image to load, and accepted that as the price of being online. You had a Nokia brick before anyone had a smartphone. You had an AIM away message before anyone used the word algorithm. You had a MySpace page with an HTML background you coded yourself, before you knew what coding was. You watched Titanic in theaters as a kid. You watched 9/11 happen in a middle school or high school classroom. You graduated into the 2008 financial crisis. You are not an 80s kid. You don't have a real memory of the decade, just the aesthetics your older siblings passed down. But you were not quite a 90s kid either. The core 90s experience belongs to people born 1990 and later. You were already navigating high school, while most of them were still figuring out elementary school. You have spent your entire entire life sitting in a category that culture has never fully named. Psychology has. And what it found about this specific birth window is more significant than most people inside it have ever been told. Here is what it actually feels like to belong to this exact cohort. When you're in a room full of 80s kids, you recognize the references, but you're always slightly off. The things they're most nostalgic about are things you know secondhand. You were there at the very end of something, not in the middle of it. And there's a difference. The feeling isn't quite
And
home.
that's a perfect explanation, bro, because I've been through it, but I'm a fucking 90s kid, bro. Like, I was at the end of these people generation, bro. So they pass it on to me. So I feel more nostalgic to the 80s and the 90s. That is so weird, bro. Because I've been through all of this, bro.
When you're with 90s,
most of it
kids, the same thing happens in reverse. They talk about dial-up internet as childhood. You remember dial-up internet as high school. They grew up with the early internet as something playful. You watched it arrive and immediately understood, at a formative age, that it was going to change everything, because you'd already lived the before. You've been handed labels over the years. Zennial, the Oregon Trail generation, geriatric millennial. None of them ever quite landed. Because a label that tries to split the difference between two real things doesn't usually capture what it actually feels like to live in the gap.
What most people in this birth window share and rarely hear articulated
is a very specific psychological tension, a sense that they never fully belong to one era or the other. Not because they don't have a strong identity, because they have parts of two identities, and spent their entire formative years learning how to...
Like I belong in every generation. I'm not gonna die. That's how I feel.
Hold both at once. That is not a personality quirk. That is a developmental condition. And psychology has a framework for understanding exactly what it does to a generation. The 1986 to 1990 cohort experienced something that no other birth window before or after will ever experience in precisely the same way. You had a fully analog childhood, real boredom, long summers with nothing to do and nobody available to call, being genuinely unreachable between the time you left school and the time you walked in your front door.
Real, bro.
Finding things out slowly, through friends, through word of mouth, through the kid in your neighborhood who seemed to know everything. Your brain built its foundational architecture. It's
Half the time he's lying. I promise you.
sense of self, its emotional baseline, its understanding of how the social world works in that environment. And then, during your adolescence and early adulthood, that world was almost entirely replaced. The social structures changed. The communication changed. The economy changed. The technology changed. And it didn't happen gradually the way earlier generations experienced technological evolution, one thing at a time, over decades. It happened in a single compressed window, your 20s. Developmental psychologists call this a cohort effect. The principle that the historical and environmental conditions a generation passes through during their formative years leave a structural imprint on psychology, not a preference, not a habit, but an actual change in how the brain is wired. The cohort that lived through the Depression didn't just remember it. They thought differently about risk and security for the rest of their lives. The conditions became part of the architecture. What is specific and unusual about the 1986 to 1990 cohort is that they underwent two distinct cohort effects in a single lifetime. Their childhood wired them for patience, for in-person connection, for delayed information, for self-directed boredom. Then their early adulthood rewired them for speed, for digital communication, for instant access, for permanent connectivity. Most generations get one. This cohort absorbed both, simultaneously building an adult identity while the world they'd been trained for was being replaced. That is an unusual amount of recalibration to ask of a developing nervous system. In 2011, economists Ulrika Malmendier and Stefan Nagel published a study in the Quarterly Journal of Economics that tracked how early economic experience permanently shapes financial psychology across a lifetime. Their data, drawn from decades of survey responses across multiple cohorts, showed that people who experience economic collapse during formative years don't adjust and recover the way older people do. The experience changes their relationship to risk, to financial security, and to institutional trust at a structure.
Because it's like, in their head, they don't have stability. They don't think, okay, the economy or the world's gonna change again. That do make sense.
It persists long after the economic conditions improve. For the 1986 to 1990 cohort, that collapse was 2008, and the timing was precise in the worst possible way. You were 18 to 22 years old, your first job, your first apartment, the first time you had tried to build anything that looked like adult life on your own terms, and the floor dropped. Research on recession cohorts consistently shows that those who enter adulthood during an economic contraction don't just earn less in the short term, they earn less for a decade or more. The initial setback compounds. The caution compounds. The slow, persistent recalibration of what stable means, that compounds too. You are not anxious about financial security because of a personal flaw. You are not resistant to certain kinds of risk because you are overly cautious. Your relationship to money and stability was calibrated by the specific conditions of the moment you became an adult. That calibration is not irrational. It is the most rational possible response to what actually happened to you at the exact moment it happened. Here is what has not been said clearly enough about being born in this specific window. You speak two languages, said clearly enough about...
Okay, I'm gonna be honest. I'm from here to here. These are my times. These three. But I have seen a VH tape in like my grandma's house.
Being born in this specific window. You speak two languages, not in the linguistic sense, in the cultural and cognitive sense. You are fluent in an analog world and a digital one, because you were required to learn both from scratch in real time, without a guide, in the middle of your own development. You know what boredom actually feels like, the long, unplugged version that younger cohorts have almost no experience with. That capacity lives in you. The ability to sit in a space without stimulation and generate something from it. The ability to tolerate not knowing something immediately. That is increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. You also know how to adapt faster than almost any other cohort, because adaptation was the dominant experience of your entire adolescence and early adulthood. Every few years, something fundamental about the world changed, and you kept pace, not because someone handed you a map, but because you had no other option, and because your childhood had already trained you to figure things out slowly and independently before the pace increased. You are more comfortable with ambiguity.
That's the things your parents can't teach you. You just gotta figure that out on your own. Like, you know what I'm saying? Should I watch this one after?
Acuity than people on either side of your birth window, because your formative years contained more genuine ambiguity, more technological, economic, and cultural uncertainty than any previous generation had faced within a single developmental window. And you are grounded in a way that sometimes surprises people, because you actually remember, not as an intellectual fact, but as a felt memory, what life felt like before all of it arrived. The generation that grew up between two worlds learned to live between two worlds. And the people who can do that are rarely fully disoriented when the world changes again. There is something that deserves to be said plainly about what your generation actually carried. You watched the world your childhood was built on get replaced. Not slowly, over generations, the way the world has always changed. quickly, in your 20s. The stores you grew up going to closed. The formats you memorized became obsolete. The economy you were told was waiting for you on the other side of your education turned out to be a different economy entirely. And you adapted. You always adapted. You were not given a mourning period for the version of the world that ended before you got to fully inhabit it. The timeline just moved forward, and you moved with it, because that's what it required. What that experience builds is something the generational labels don't fully capture. It's not nostalgia, though you have more of it than most people your age, because you have more to be nostalgic about. It's not cynicism, though you've earned every trace of it. It's something closer to a specific, hard-won kind of perspective. The perspective of someone who has lived inside more than one version of reality and knows, not theoretically, but from the inside, how quickly everything that feels permanent turns out to be temporary. That is not a small thing. Most people spend their entire lives operating inside a single version of the world. You have already navigated at least two, and the transitions between them weren't gentle. You are not the forgotten generation. You are the generation that learned to carry two worlds at once, and that has made
the crazy part, because like animals don't have to. Well, for the most part, animals don't have to think about that. It's basically the same thing over and over again for them until they grow up and like they gotta be responsible for their self. But they don't have to worry about like the economy, society. They just gotta wake up and eat. And like even ants, like they just do the same thing every day until they die.
Without the right label, without a cultural moment that was fully yours, without anyone quite seeing the specific weight of your particular timeline, one of the most adaptable, most self-sufficient, most quietly resilient cohorts that modern psychology has documented. Nobody handed you that. You built it. In the gap between everything. If this described your generation more accurately than anything you've read before, subscribe. The next video goes somewhere your brain is already going after watching.
That's the end of the video.